Our next session, as you've joined the room, will be led by Yolandi. I'll introduce Yolandi to us shortly, and she'll be joined by speakers. That includes Michael Sachs, who's with us in the venue. Thank you for joining us, Michael. It will include Rashad, who's also sitting somewhere. The light is too bright, but Rashad is sitting somewhere. Deborah Makwira-Miti, who's my line manager, and Keta Dlamini are joining us online. And just a bit about Yolandi, who will be facilitating the session, a beautiful lady sitting next to me here. Yolandi is the Chief Director for Macroeconomic Policy within the Economic Policy Division of the National Treasury. She holds a Master's of Commerce in Economics that she got in 2002 from the University of Johannesburg, and a Master of Business Administration from Henley Business School in 2022. Since 2009, she has held the position of Director in the Economic Policy Division in various chief directorates, including the Regulatory Impact Office of the Deputy Director General of Economic Policy and Macroeconomic Policy. Before being appointed as the Chief Director of Macroeconomic Policy in 2021, Yolandi her work spans macro regulations, competition, monetary, as well as fiscal policy, as well as financial markets. So we are in good hands, someone that has been through all what you're looking to hear about. Ladies and gentlemen, please, both online and in the house, put your hands together and help me welcome Yolandi Smith.
Now, Michael is a professor at the University of Witwatersrand. He is currently the Deputy Chair of the Finance and Fiscal Commission, which is an independent commission established by the Constitution, and he leads the Public Economy Project, a research initiative that builds independent analytical capabilities on macro fiscal policy, public economics, and public financial management in South Africa. The project is located at Wits University's Southern Center for Inequality Studies. Michael, over to you.
Thank you very much, Yolandi. I'm not sure, I suppose I'm supposed to present from here, but I feel this is designed for Vusi and not for me. I don't know why. So either Vusi, we need to give him some growth hormones, or you can cut me off at the knees, but let's see. I'm presenting here, and let me say that my presentation is quite long, and I won't go through all of the slides that I have. I hope they can be circulated to you here and those online. But it covers, I'm starting off by talking about what I think is the central challenge that we have today, which is the contradiction between the budget on the one hand and government policy on the other hand. I'm then going to look at how we have, over the last decade or two, succeeded in containing expenditure. Thank you, sir. Can you also lift it up? Thank you. How effectively Treasury has curtailed the growth, or government has curtailed the growth of expenditure over the last 2 decades or so. But despite this achievement, if you want to call it that, of reducing the growth of expenditure, especially since the COVID pandemic, we have a changed macro fiscal context, which now requires even more austerity, if I can call it that, in the years ahead to stabilize debt. The section on spending choices then goes into what are some of the contradictions and issues in public finance and spending allocations, but I probably won't go into that, and then I'll finish with some conclusions. So let me just go back there and say this week, if you looked at the Sunday Times on last Sunday, there was a headline that said, "Government has run out of money." And it reflected a letter from the then Acting Director General of National Treasury, Ismail Momoniat, which was sent out, I think, hours before he handed over the reins to the new Director General of Treasury, Duncan Peterser, that said to all departments that they must freeze hiring of new posts, They must stop procurement of new infrastructure projects and impose a whole series of expenditure ceilings or cuts to travel and conferencing and other items. Now, in the day before that headline, or on the same day that that headline appeared on the Sunday Times, the ANC had a rally in Dobsonville in Soweto, where they announced a review of their manifesto. And in their manifesto review, they say that they want to increase the value of the COVID SRD grant and ensure that it is accessible to many more members. They want to implement national health insurance, and they want to extend and expand government's, the presidential employment stimulus, which we're going to be hearing a lot about later today and tomorrow. And so what you have here is a demonstration of my point, which is that there is the problem we have with budgeting and fiscal policy today is that the budget is moving in one direction, but policy led by the governing party, but also from the presidency, is moving in a different direction. And this contradiction has been with us for many years, but it is intensifying. And I think a very good articulation of this contradiction was given to us by the Minister of Defense, Mayor Thandi Modise, in her budget vote speech earlier in the year. And remember, the budget vote speech of the minister is intended to capture how they see the execution of their budget. And in her budget vote speech, Thandi Modise said, a scientific evaluation of the SAD-NDF has painted a bleak picture of our diminishing capabilities, largely because of persistent budget cuts, the ravages of underfunding and unserviceable capabilities against escalating tasks has had a devastating effect. Every evaluation process of the Department of Defense points to the inevitable need for more boots on the ground to execute many tasks given to the department. To the contrary, government directs the downward management of our human resource baseline. It is our duty to reconcile these mutually exclusive positions. Sustained funding of the SANDF remains an unavoidable requirement. Now, it's my argument that you can extend what Thandi Modise has said here to other parts of government service provision. The SANDF, the Defense Force, and defense in general, has indeed faced extremely difficult fiscal conditions, probably going back many years, but intensifying in the last 3 to 5 years. They've been overspending their compensation budget every year for the last 2 or 3 years. And it looks like also this year they will overspend their compensation budget. But you can apply the same logic, maybe not to such a large extent, but you can apply the same logic to many other services that government provides, including the criminal justice system and police, the hospitals, basic education, social services, and all of the services government provides. So you can see this, first of all, in the last sentence, that sustained funding of these functions remains an unavoidable requirement. We cannot defund healthcare, basic education, social services, and criminal justice. And if we do defund those things, we will end up in a situation where it rebounds on the growth and development of the economy and undermines the future of society. So we're kind of forced to continue funding these things. And part of funding these things means boots on the ground. It means having the doctors, the nurses, the teachers, and the police officers that are required to do those jobs, because most of the services that government provides are highly labor intensive. You cannot have basic education without teachers. You cannot have healthcare without nurses and doctors. You cannot have criminal justice without police officers, without judges and magistrates and people in the courts. And this is kind of a condition of these services. But despite this labor intensity and the centrality of human beings in developing these services, we have had intense pressure on the compensation budget. That arises in part because of the wage agreements in the public sector, in the public service, which have raised the salaries of the public servants, as I'll show you that just now, not by too much, but by a significant amount. And the budget has been unable to fund that full salary increase, and the consequence has been a diminishment, a fall in the number of people employed relative to the population that they service. So if you look at the number of teachers relative to the number of learners in schools, or you look at the number of nurses relative to the number of people who don't have medical insurance, or you look at the number of police officers relative to the population, all of those numbers are going down. So we are withdrawing our service provision to the population in all of those things. So on the one hand, our policy, and a good example is health. There's a policy called the National Human Resource Strategy for Health, which says that South Africa has an insufficient number of doctors and nurses to implement NHI, and we need to increase those numbers going forward. So the policy demands that are being placed on the departments require an expansion of headcounts, but also generally an expansion of services. But on the other hand, the budget is mandating a reduction of headcounts or a reduction of services. So another example, and I think I feel very strongly that Thandi Modise is the only minister that has raised these issues starkly and put on the table the truth, if you like. Most of the other ministers, when they present their budget speeches, either avoid these problems or speak or talk as if they're moving in a completely different direction that organizes from where the budget is going. And a good example of this is the Minister of Police, who announced in his budget vote speech that a total of 10,000 police trainees will be recruited annually for the next 2 financial years, which will bring a total of 30,000 new police recruits over the medium-term strategic framework period. In other words, over the next 3 years, he wants to bring in 30,000 new police recruits into the department. Now, the contradiction there is reflected in the letter from the Acting Director General of National Treasury last week, which said you must freeze recruitment of new personnel across the whole of government. What the graph here is showing you is the number of people employed by the South African Police Service. Not only police officers, but just the total employment in the department. And you can see around the time of the World Cup in 2010, 2011, it reached 200,000 people. And since then, the number of employees in the department has fallen by about 20,000 to around 25,000 people less employed in the department up to about 2021. And if you look at the estimates of national expenditure, they give you 2 things. They tell you what is going to be the head count of the department over the next 3 years, but they also tell you what is the budget for compensation of employees. So this is what the E&E is saying the head count of the department is going to be over the next 3 years, which strongly supports what Bheki Cele is saying in that quotation, that there's going to be an increasing headcount over the next number of years. But if you take the budget that is in the same estimate of national expenditure, and you assume that the wage agreement that was agreed with Labour in just after the budget is implemented, the only way that wage agreement can be implemented within the budget that the police has is by reducing the headcounts by another 5 or 10,000, about 8,000 people in the next year. So again, there's this direct contradiction between where policy is going and where the budget is going. Now, there may be a strong argument and a strong need to consolidate the fiscus, to stabilize debt, to reduce spending even more. But there are two ways you can do that. You can either accept that this is necessary and plan accordingly and ask, where can we reduce employment in the public services? Where can we reduce expenditure? Where can we cut in a way that will do the least damage to government services? That's one way of doing it, and essentially that's what was done in the 1990s during the program called GEAR, where there was a very clear policy direction to reduce the size of employment in the public service. That was targeted, and all of the departments were on board. The presidency backed it, the treasury backed it. It was the program of the whole of government. The problem we have today is that one part of government, meaning the treasury, and maybe we could say team finance, is moving in one direction, and the rest of government appears to be in denial about the direction to move in. And the problem with that is that if you impose this austerity simply by imposing budget ceilings, and you leave it to the system to churn out what will be the result is likely to be even further damage to services, because those with power and voice within the system will be able to defend their access to resources, and those without power and voice within the system will find themselves the victims of the worst problems of austerity. And of course, those without power and voice within the system include, for example, mental health patients, children in primary schools, victims of crime and gender-based violence. And so we can either have an organized, conscious, and effective austerity, or we can have what we have now, which is unorganized, and we leave it to the system to churn out the result. Okay, that's my opening speech. I've got 10 minutes left. Okay, but I've probably said everything I want to say, but let me just substantiate some of the points that I made. This graph is showing the nominal growth of spending in the budget over the last something wrong, something funny went with the numbers here, I'm not sure. But it's since the year 2000 is here. And it's showing the nominal growth. What do I mean by nominal growth? I mean just the growth in the cash amounts. So if you have 100 Rand you're spending this year and 110 Rand the next year, you've had a 10% growth in the cash amount of Rand that you allocate in the budget. And this is important because essentially the budget is a system for planning and executing nominal cash amounts. So we appropriate, when we vote and we appropriate a budget amount, it's a Rand cash amount that we're appropriating. So it's showing since 2000, in the 2000s, spending each year was growing at around 15% year on year. From around, and it's unfortunate the dates here are a bit messed up, but from around 2010 to 2012, I think 2012 is here, you saw a sharp reduction in the rate of spending growth. And that spending growth was curtailed more and more until 2017, 2018, when the new administration came into office, and you saw a sudden increase in the rate of spending growth. That was sharply curtailed in the year of the COVID pandemic, and the year of the COVID pandemic saw the slowest growth of expenditure that we have seen in the history of the country in nominal terms. It increased a little bit, but the point is, and these are the numbers set out in the budget, the point is that spending growth in nominal terms is now, even with the budget that now looks to be unaffordable, it's at its lowest rate of growth ever. And the question is, since we face now a challenged and a new macro fiscal condition, and we're told that this spending growth must come down even further, what are going to be the consequences of that policy? Now, part of the reduction in spending growth has been the containment of the government wage bill. So the graph on the right shows you the real growth of the whole compensation budget, of compensation spending on the main budget. And you can see, again, I'm not sure what happened with the dates here, but around the early part, 2010, 2011, you had, this is now real growth, very rapid real growth of the compensation budget. But the compensation budget has been growing around 1.5% or 2% per annum since around 2012. And then since the COVID pandemic, you've had a compensation budget that has kind of gone up and down around zero increase. And what it shows here is, firstly, this is what was assumed in the budget that would happen this year. So this year's budget assumed that there would be a 4% real reduction in compensation budgets in the current year. That has not happened, and if we include the wage agreement that was entered into to April, we still get a negative growth of the compensation budget, but it's much less negative than the almost impossible target that was set in the budget. So that's the point from the point of view of the budget. From the point of view of the public servants, what has been happening? The graph on the right shows you 3 lines. The red line is median wage settlements in the economy. So across the economy, public sector and private sector, what have been the wage settlements? And you can see they're around 7.5. They reduce a little bit after 2019, going into COVID, and then rise again. But the cost of living adjustments awarded to public servants were about the same level in 2015, 2016, but sharply reduced down to 2020, the year of the COVID pandemic, when public servants got a zero cost of living adjustment. And so since around 2019, public servants' wage settlements have departed significantly from private sector settlements. But this line shows you CPI, average inflation in the economy, and shows since 2020, public servants' wage settlements have been far below the rate of CPI inflation. So a lot of this expenditure containment has been a successful, substantial reduction in the growth of compensation spending. Okay, I will finish in 5 minutes. Now, what I want to show you here is that, first of all, the red line is exactly the same as the red line I had before, but I've now superimposed it on the nominal growth of the economy. Because when I talk about cash amounts, you know, cash, the value of cash changes, so I have to relate it to some other factor that is changing, and I've chosen GDP, the growth of GDP in nominal terms. You can see again in the 2010s, growth of spending was far ahead of growth of GDP. So spending as a share of GDP, what it means during this period in the 2010s, was increasing very rapidly. But spending was broadly brought in line with GDP growth from 2012. 2012 is about there. So from 2012 up until 2017, spending was more or less in line with GDP growth. We then had that blip at the beginning of the new administration, but when COVID hit, spending was brought below nominal GDP growth. Part of the reason it was brought below nominal GDP growth was because we had a nominal boom. So since the COVID period, prices increased rapidly. We had surprise inflation, and we had a surprise commodity boom. And that surprise inflation was both globally and domestically. And so you had this surprise inflation that brought GDP growth up in nominal terms and allowed expenditure as a share of GDP to drop. So what you had in the last few years was inflation easing the path of consolidation. So these are the the CPI, the projections of CPI contained in successive budget documents. And you can see in 2021, this is what CPI was projected to do. In 2022 budget, it was higher. In the 2023 budget, it was even higher. So we had a surprise inflation shock. And the combination of containing expenditure growth and this surprise inflation shock closed the jaws of the hippopotamus. If you remember, Tito Mboweni had a graph and said, we've got the jaws of the hippopotamus have opened, and this is essentially the same graph. And this is now as a percent of GDP. We after COVID, this huge jaws opened, but in 2021, 2022, we actually closed the jaws and revenue rose above core spending on the budget. Now, the challenge we have going forward, and maybe to conclude, is that we're no longer going to have that support from inflation. Because inflation, if you need to stabilize your fiscal position, inflation is your friend. So going forward over the next 3 years, we're going to have to, according to the consensus now emerging within Treasury, cut the budget even more and reduce the growth of spending even below the historic lows that we reached in the last 3 years. But unlike the last 3 years, in the next 3 years, we're going to have a much lower rate of inflation and a much more vigorous effort on the part of the Reserve Bank to contain expenditure. Now, I will just conclude by saying it may be necessary to do these things. It may be necessary to contain expenditure and cut budgets. But we should also be aware that these actions have consequences. And since I work for a Center for Inequality Studies, I want to mention the consequences for inequality. Because budget spending, there are two groups in society that are going to be particularly impacted by this containment of budget spending. The first is the lower middle class, because a substantial share of the lower middle class are government employees. And so as wages are contained and headcounts are reduced, that strata of society is going to feel the impact. The second strata is the users of government services. Primary school students, pupils, mental health patients, victims of crime. And again, overwhelmingly, these are poor South Africans who depend on public services. At the same time, as interest rates rise, what interest rates do, rising interest rates, is improve and sustain bank profitability. And so we're going to have more profits and income at the top of society while that burden of adjustment is distributed to the bottom. So I don't have a very clear solution to these problems, except to say that the first thing that needs to happen is we must align government's policy agenda with its fiscal agenda. One way or another, that's really where the jaws of the hippopotamus need to be closed. So thank you very much, Yolandi, and I'll look forward to the debate.
And thank you, Michael, for keeping to time. We are going to go for a short break now. Right after the break, we'll take a couple of questions on Michael's presentation, and thereafter our panel members will delve into some of these issues a little bit more deeply. Thank you very much, everyone.